Good evening, and welcome to the Nantucket Whaling Museum. The Nantucket Historical Association is very pleased to bring you our socially distanced commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the Whaleship Essex tragedy. My name is Michael Harrison. I'm the Obed Macy Research Chair here at the Nantucket Historical Association, and we are thrilled to be this evening in conversation with Nathaniel Philbrick, longtime islander here. Nat and his wife arrived on Nantucket in 1986 and have lived here ever since. And Nat is a historian and has written numerous books about the island. In the year 2000, published In the Heart of the Sea, a book about the Essex tragedy, which won the National Book Award in 2000 for nonfiction. Since then, he's gone on to write quite a number of books. A very good book about the U.S. exploring expedition, looking at the Mayflower, a whole variety of other interesting topics, branching off from sort of Nantucket. This is a sort of sea base for all of the history work that Nat's done. But we are thrilled that everybody can join us this evening. This story of the Essex tragedy is a sort of near and dear story to Nantucket and to Nantucket's identity as a historic whaling port. And this organization, the Nantucket Whaling Museum, is a unique place to be able to tell this story. We preserve the history of Nantucket for the people of Nantucket, and we have lots of collections related to this story, and it's sort of in our bones, as it were. So we are really thrilled to be able to have all of you join us this evening for a conversation about the Essex.
You're here. I second that, and Mike, it's really great to be in conversation with you. There's no one who knows Nantucket history like you do.
Well, thank you. So the basic thing, we're here to talk about the Essex, and I suppose the question of the evening we should start with, in case anybody who's joining us may not know, what are the basic things everybody should know about the Essex tragedy?
Yeah, well, the Essex left Nantucket in the summer of 1819, just the year after the Pacific National Bank was built. She was a typical whale ship, about 20 years old, not in great repair. She had a first-time captain, George Pollard Jr., first mate Owen Chase, 21 men. The cabin boy was Thomas Nickerson, and they departed and headed for the Pacific. It was a normal whaling voyage, not a very successful one, as they made their way around Cape Horn, up the west coast of South America, and they decided to venture out farther into the Pacific than the Essex had ever been before, to the offshore grounds. And they were, after a stop at the Galapagos, they were 3,000 miles from the coast of South America when they sighted a huge sperm whale, 85 feet long. This is a huge whale. If you know the huge jaw here at the Whaling Museum, that reputedly came from an 85-foot whale, just massive, particularly when you realize the ship was 85 feet long. Well, one of the whaleboats was damaged, and so first mate Owen Chase dragged that boat up onto the deck of the Whaleship Essex, was repairing it, while the other two whaleboats were off pursuing whales. Cabin boy Thomas Nickerson, all of 15 years old, was at the helm steering when this huge 85-foot sperm whale appeared on their port side. They didn't think much of it because never before in the history of American whaling had a whale attacked a ship. But this whale had a different intention. It began to pick up speed, slammed into the side of the ship, knocked the men to their sides, would come back at it again, drive the ship backwards, crush the bow like an eggshell. The ship would not sink, but it would fill up with water. The men would take to their whaleboats. They all gathered, and Captain Pollard would eventually arrive and say to Mr. Chase, because they were over the horizon, they hadn't seen all what happened, would say to Chase, Mr. Chase, what is the matter? These were men of few words. Chase simply said, "We have been stove by a whale." Now, many of us have, if you don't know about the Essex, you're probably familiar with Moby-Dick. This would inspire the climax of that great American novel. But where Moby-Dick ends is just the beginning of the Essex disaster. It would turn into a survival tale like none other, fearful of rumors of cannibals in the islands to the west, in the Pacific. They decided to go for South America, 3,000 miles away. Impossible voyage. And the great irony, they would be forced to survive cannibalism. Eventually, only 2 of the 3 whaleboats would be sighted by rescue craft. 5 Nantucketers would get out of those whaleboats alive. 3 others were left on Henderson Island. And when news came to Nantucket and eventually the rest of the country, this was big news. This is before the American West had become the predominant wilderness that incited the American imagination. The sea was the wilderness. This was the Donner Party, before that all unfolded. Owen Chase would write an account of it, probably ghostwritten, that would become renowned around the country and the world. This was big news. And so the Essex, this was a tale that Nantucketers were not particularly proud of because it was a voyage that went bad, but it was a story full of all sorts of fascination for those outside Nantucket. And so, this was a story I realized I needed to write about.
Yeah, and there's some interesting things in this disaster that come to mind as you're retelling it. On the one hand, this part of the Pacific that they were whaling in, the offshore ground, had only been discovered by American whalers a year or 2 before as being a place rich with sperm whales. And so this wasn't really a part of the ocean that the crew of the Essex or many of their Nantucket brethren had been to, that they knew very well. They were sort of more comfortable on the coast of South America. But there was money to be made and they ventured out. And so on the one hand, they were sort of in the unknown, taking a risk. But then here they are cast into their boats with their ship wrecked. And imagine us being cast into a boat in the middle of the Pacific. I don't know how you're a reputable sailor. You might be able to do some really great stuff, Nat. I would be like at my wit's end.
Oh, I'm with you.
But here are professional sailors who are able to salvage things from the wreck. They're able to rig their rowing boats to sail. They're actually able, they have all these professional skills they bring to bear to actually save themselves. And the great irony or tragedy of this, either way, is that they're outmatched by the circumstance. They make a decision not to go to the nearest islands because they have heard there are cannibals there. Again, a reflection perhaps of maybe something slightly provincial about Nantucket or a limitation in their knowledge, maybe not, but they know South America. They're going to go to South America. And so that's where they go. And it just happens to be that sailing against the prevailing winds for 3,000 miles in boats that don't have centerboards and not enough water and food doesn't work very well.
I thought long and hard and tried to examine it in my research. How did they do this? What were they thinking? This is a story of survival. And when you're in a survival situation, it's your fears that drive you. It's very hard to think rationally. And the fears they all had were the unknown Pacific. This was very early in Pacific whaling. The only thing they knew about these islands were rumors of cannibals. And the Nantucketers were very adventuresome. They had taken it farther than anyone else when it came to the exploration of the world, but they're also very conservative. They built their knowledge incrementally. And unless they could hear it from someone they knew, they didn't trust that information. And so the one thing they did know was the sea, whaleboats, and whale ships. And so when forced to it, they just as you described, here's a whaleboat right here. This boat's from a later era. It's much larger than the Essex whaleboats were, which were only 25 feet long. And they built up their sides so that a large wave wouldn't necessarily flood it. These boats were not yet equipped with sails, but they rigged up their own sails, 2 little masts. They turned them into schooners, and off they went, finally falling into the only thing they knew, to get back to a civilized coast. And so for me, the story of the Essex is a tale of human survival. But as you alluded to, these guys had tremendous skills, but ultimately it would be nature that would call the shots in what they would endure in the weeks and even months ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And the irony that we see in the story now as modern observers of they don't want to go to certain islands because they're afraid of cannibalism, but then they end up having to resort to cannibalism in the boats. I mean, they're in these boats for 3 months. 3 months in an open boat.
Yeah, I mean that's an entire summer.
Yeah, right.
And you're at sea, and they had in the Galapagos Islands. They had at that point in the history of whaling, it was common to round up Galapagos tortoises, huge creatures that could get over 100 pounds, and store them like wood, stacks of wood in the hold. And they would, and these Galapagos tortoises could live for months, even as long as a year, without any food and water, and provide the crew with wonderful meat. And so when this whale attacked their ship, they had all these Galapagos tortoises. And so they put 2 of those tortoises in each whaleboat. They had some bread, some water, and that was the key thing. They didn't have a lot of water. And off they went. For me, the closest I could get to sort of getting my head imaginatively around what they were going through was to think in terms of science fiction. I mean, this is like a spaceship that's blown up and you're in your escape pod in the middle of the universe. I mean, the Pacific was space for them, really. And, and here they are out there just doing their best to try to get back home.
Yeah, and hoping, they know that there are other ships out there, British ships, American ships, Nantucket ships. They're hoping maybe they'll pass one. But imagine, sailing through an area the size of Texas, hoping you're going to pass, one of the 60, 70 other whale ships that are out there. And luck or not luck, they didn't pass any others.
They felt that if everything went right, if the winds worked perfectly, they might be able to get to the coast of South America in a month and a half, and their provisions would last that. But of course, not everything would go wrong. Like you said, they were always hopeful that someone would discover them. That didn't happen. They began to run out of water. They were dying of dehydration when they sight an island they were not aware of. They misnamed it, called it Duchy Island. It was actually Henderson Island. You can't make this stuff up. And so, just as they're on the verge of death, they sight this island, sail up to it, and there's no water. They can't find any water until, luckily, it's a spring high and low tide. And at dead low tide, bubbling from a rock that's usually submerged is fresh water. This is positively biblical,
right?
And this saves them for now. And but they would realize that and this is almost a metaphor for the human race on this planet, because within just a couple of days, a couple of weeks, they realized they were killing off all of the wildlife that they could sustain themselves with, the birds. And if they stayed for any length of time, they would ultimately starve. So they decide we got to push on. And it's then where 3 men, not Nantucketers, a couple of them from Cape Cod, one was an Englishman, realized, this is an ingrown group of Nantucketers. Good luck to you boys. We're going to stay on dry land. And so they would stay, very emotional parting. And ultimately they would be rescued because the survivors would send a rescue ship there. But in another great irony, it turned out that rock from which water would bubble up would, as the tide moved on from spring low, would never again come above the tide line. And so they began to die of dehydration. And so they would barely make it when they were on the verge of death when they were rescued. But once again, it's a story of incredible human endurance, full of all sorts of ins and outs, and it's a story that really captures the imagination.
And it's interesting. I was asked once by somebody, so these people, a few of these people survive. They go through this horrible ordeal. They come home. What's the importance of this? What's the lasting impact of their tragedy? We think now of airplane disasters or any variety of modern calamities that bring about, changes in legislation and changes in safety. The Titanic disaster, the very famous example of changing all kinds of rules and regulations. And so somebody asked me, well, what did this do for whaling?
Not much. I mean, well, Nantucketers, this had never happened before. It seemed to them like, just a random act. As Pollard would say, Captain Pollard would say, he would be given a ship and depart within months of his return to Nantucket. Clearly, no one, faulted him or anyone else in the crew. But as he would say to a young naval officer he met along the west coast of South America, that, because the naval officer said he had just read the story of the Essex, like so many Americans. And he said, "You're not Captain Pollard of the Essex?" And he said, "Yes, I am." And he said, "How could you ever go out there again?" And Pollard would say, "Well, on Nantucket, we have a saying, the lightning never strikes twice." For Pollard, it would. Off Hawaii, in a storm, they would fetch up on French frigate shoals. The ship would be beaten to death on the coral. They would take to their whaleboats. That was said, Thomas Nickerson, that cabin boy, was with him when this happened, and would leave an account of it. He said they had to drag Pollard off the deck. He did not want to get back into a whaleboat under these circumstances. Luckily, they would be rescued the next day. But as Pollard would say to a missionary who he would meet on his return to Nantucket, of all places, the Pacific Islands, Tahiti, one of the places they had decided not to go to because of fear of cannibals, he would say to the missionary, "Back home, I will be judged an unlucky man." And yes, that was right. He would never go to the sea again and live out his life as a night watchman.
Yeah. It's interesting. You've alluded to a couple of the sort of written sources for this story. And as a historian wanting to tell these compelling stories from the past, we rely on the evidence that exists for it. I think it's really interesting in this case that there are two really compelling firsthand accounts by two of the survivors. And then there are a variety of these sort of secondhand accounts where, like, the missionary who met Captain Pollard then wrote down what he remembered Pollard saying, and naval officers doing the same thing. I would love to hear a little bit about, sort of your encounter when you were on Nantucket before you wrote the book with these sources that then inspired actually, looking more closely at this and writing about it anew.
Yeah, well, I when I look back, I didn't know how lucky I was to be living on Nantucket, where you had not only this wonderful whaling museum and research center, which has Thomas Nickerson's account, which he wrote late in life, which had just been really newly discovered when I took up this story. It's just an extraordinary document. It's the kind of book you get at a stationery store today. Where he had written out his account of it and even done wonderful drawings of the event. So to hold that in your hand is extraordinary. But there's also the Athenaeum, which has its own great archive. The newspapers had just been recently microwaved, right?
Indeed.
Microfilmed. There's the town building. But I have to say, one of the resources the historical you guys had was the genealogy had just gone online. And so it was possible now, really for the first time, to take two people and figure out how closely they were related. And I was very curious, how closely related were the Nantucketers? And so I did that with each one, figure it out how they were all, and they were all related, over and over again. And survival situations, it's people it's groups of people that have a pre-existing bond, whether it's spiritual, whether it's cultural, that tend to make it out at a higher rate than those who don't have those kinds of bonds. And so that probably helped the fact that there were only 5 Nantucket survivors from the whaleboats at the end. But the other thing, I went to Mystic Seaport and spent time in the Charles W. Morgan, the last remaining American wooden whale ship. I spent a lot of time in the forecastle channeling what it would have been like when a whale attacked, and went to the Kendall Whaling Museum, which then had its own wonderful collection that's now a part of the New Bedford Whaling Museum, another key source. And so all of these provided, history isn't what happened in the past. It's what we tell using the evidence of what came from the past. You don't know everything about what happened. You just have these artifacts from the past, whether it's a journal, a letter, a newspaper account, all of these kinds of things. And you take that all together. There was even crew lists here that the NHA had, all sorts of this stuff. You take this all together, and it's the historian's job then to try to tell the story as best you can, being truthful to what historical accounts you have. And inevitably, they disagree in some instances between Chase and Nickerson. That happened. And then you have to make the judgment call, who to believe.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because the Nantucket Historical Association holds, quite a few of these things that you worked from. And, in 2015, a film version of your book came out, the big Hollywood treatment.
Yeah.
Inspired by, I might put it that way, inspired by your book. And so here at the NHA, we took that opportunity to sort of reassess the Essex tragedy and do an exhibit about it and look anew at some of these artifacts and some of these things and bring them out and put them on display. And it was one of the first projects I worked on here at the association. And, we're going to do a show about the Essex with all of our stuff about the Essex. And so, okay, let's see what we have in terms of artifacts. And as I'm fond of saying, the Nantucket Historical Association holds all the surviving artifacts from the Essex disaster, both of them. Because when you look at one way of looking at it, things that are actually from the ship, there's basically one. And it's this piece of twine.
Oh, it's the most heartbreaking artifact.
Totally. Totally. You want to describe the twine for us?
Yeah, this is a crew member, and it's just this little framed piece of twine where one of the crew members in the whaleboats would take the fibers from the sails, from his clothing, and weave a piece of twine out of it. And you often see this behavior in survival situations where so much time is passing, you're terrified all the time. What do you do under these circumstances to just stay sane? You take up the equivalent of a hobby. Yeah. And in this instance, this young teenager was creating this piece of twine. And when he was pulled out of the whaleboats, he still had that piece of twine with him, which clearly was important enough to him and his family that it eventually ended up here. Do you remember when it became a part of the collection?
It became part of the collection in 1914. Benjamin Lawrence, the crewman who made it, kept it, and then he gave it to Alexander Starbuck, who was a local historian, the great historian of Nantucket and of Nantucket whaling. I don't know all of the exactly when it was gifted, but it ended up with Starbuck, and Starbuck gave it to the NHA in 1914. And it's just as you describe. It's in this little ivory frame with a card that says, that he was in the boat 93 days, and he made this piece of twine. It's a very powerful artifact. In which they're in these boats and they have this ship, and all that's left is this piece of twine.
Yeah.
Very powerful. And now, obviously, Nat's already alluded to manuscripts. There are crew lists from previous voyages of the Essex. There's wharf books from other voyages of the ship that list the crew and have all the crew signatures. The museum holds a silver ladle that was given to Daniel Russell, the previous captain of the Essex, at the end of the previous voyage, which had been very successful. He was then given a new command, a new ship, and that's where Pollard, his former first mate, stepped up. So the ship was regarded as having greasy luck, as being a good one to be aboard. And we have artifacts that reflect that. I think another thing that the association holds that kind of reflects the power of this kind of event in the imagination is a trunk. It's a small travel trunk of the period, and it was fetched out of the sea. The story is that it was fetched out of the sea from near where the Essex wrecked. And a man on one ship who had it sold it to a man on another ship with, "This is from the Essex." And the man bought it and took it and held it dear. And then he lived in Ohio. He retired there. His family was from there. And in the 1890s, after this organization was founded, his family gave the trunk to the NHA, knowing the importance of the Essex to Nantucket. And so this is from the Essex. And it's always been displayed as trunk from the Essex. It doesn't have a single water stain on it. And they were in the boats for 3 months. How would you know that you were near the spot where the Essex sank? Nevertheless.
Right. It's one of those oral traditions meets, but hey, it's an artifact. And that's the ultimate thing about writing history is you begin to, I will always have huge respect for, the tenuousness of the evidence and our ability to really understand what actually happened. You can only, it's said that, those who don't know history will live to repeat it. Unfortunately, we're all going to repeat history, no matter how well you know it. You're in the midst of your own time. We're all living in the fog of reality. It's terrifying now. We don't know where we're going. Well, that's exactly the way it was with the crew of the Essex or any time in the past. The history is great. You can look back and say, well, this is where it was going. And there's a tendency to think it was a simpler time and they knew what they were doing. No, it's just we have the luxury of looking back. When you're in the middle of it, you don't know. And so, when things like a trunk float into the collection, who knows how, they almost become an artifact of the cultural memory of the Essex as much, even if it may not have actually been Pollard's trunk or whomever. And that's where, this institution is just so important. Not only do you have the stuff that connects, with laser directness to what happened, but you have, evidence of how an island culture responded to something like this, and so it's endlessly fascinating and something that the longer I'm in this business, the more I begin to realize how lucky I was to have live on Nantucket, to stumble onto this story and decide to tell it, and have all of this incredible organization.
Well, thank you.
Available.
Yeah, we're happy to have such great people come and use the resources and make good, do good storytelling out of it. So, this is the 200th anniversary of this disaster. It's the 20th anniversary of your book about the disaster. And I know you've been speaking at a number of forums about the book. And are there any sort of favorite stories from the process of writing the book?
Well, let's see. One of the, this was before the internet had really kicked in, so that, now you Google something and you sort of are led to it. But I was using a lot of interlibrary loan and to get not only books, but academic articles. And so I was working with the Athenaeum, which is our local library. And so working very closely with Sharon, the reference librarian. And, and she would and I was, requesting a lot of things. And at one point she called to say that some articles had come in, and it was a Saturday, and my wife, Melissa, said she was going to be in town. She'd pick them up. And so she, went up to the great hall to the reference desk, and Sharon looked worriedly into Melissa's eyes and said, "Is Nat all right?" And she said, "Well, he's working hard, but he's okay." And then Melissa went back to the car and just out of curiosity opened up the packet to see what was in it. And the first article was the caloric value of cannibalism, and so that analyzed in calories and nutrition what happens when you eat someone. And so hence Sharon's concern. And but for me, this was a research that took in the whole island. Everyone was, there were interesting, one of the traditions I had heard when I was beginning work on this, everyone had said, "Have you heard the tradition about what happened to Captain Pollard when he came back to Nantucket?" And the story was that Pollard was with some friends on the steps of the Pacific National Bank when someone from off island who had recently arrived on the ferry came up and said, "I'm looking for someone named Owen Coffin. Do you know where I can find him?" And now Owen Coffin was one of the people on the Essex who didn't make it. And Pollard is reputedly said, "Know him? Why, I ate him." So how's that for an oral tradition coming from Nantucketers? And so, and this is, I have always had an interest in the dark side of history. I'm not so much interested in the great triumphs, the inspiration. I'm really interested in kind of the scary stuff that is an index to our, what happens to people in the toughest of times. And so the darkness of the Essex story had an immediate appeal. But what I didn't, I'm a big Stephen King fan and all that kind of thing. But what I really didn't anticipate was how much I would identify with the crew members during the writing of In the Heart of the Sea. And what was amazing for me was I actually, once they got into the whaleboats, as I was writing it, they were in the whaleboats sort of during the winter of January and February. And that was the actual time of the year I was writing the book. And I had sort of a fantasy that I would write, finish that part of the thing when they were, just on the day that they were survived. But what I didn't anticipate was how hard it was going to be to write about the situation where, on Pollard's boat, there's 4 of them left, 3 of them teenage Nantucketers. They all know each other, have grown up with each other. Pollard is actually related to Owen Coffin. And they've come to the point where they know that if they do nothing, they'll probably all die of starvation. But in the custom of the sea, if they draw lots and then execute the person who got the short straw and consume his body, the rest will have a chance to live. Can you imagine to be in that situation? And when Pollard was rescued and it would be Pollard and a kid with the last name of Ramsdell, who would be found in their whaleboat. They were clutching the dead bones of their messmates. That's how it was described. And Pollard would, come onto the deck of the whale ship that rescued them. And that night, I don't know how he did it, he would tell the story of what happened. And it was recorded by Captain Paddock, Nantucketer, who listened to this. I mean, can you just imagine the drama of this man who's been at sea for 3 months, a living skeleton, reciting how they drew lots and his much younger cousin drew the short lot. Pollard reputedly said, my boy, no one's going to touch you if you don't want to do this. And the boy, who had been raised a Quaker, said, no, I like my lot as well as any other. And so they would draw lots again to see who would execute the boy. And he would be dispatched, as they said, and ultimately would be the one thing that would allow Pollard and Ramsdell to survive. And so this is tough stuff. And it was a hard process, but one that I feel just such an enormous debt to the island and those people who lived it, and just hope that the book in some way does a proper tribute to them.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned, both spending time at the Charles W. Morgan at Mystic Seaport, imbibing that atmosphere, but also then being on, there's nothing like being on Nantucket in winter to, inspire lots of thoughts. In some ways, it's easy to see how Melville grasped onto this. Melville, as a young man, goes whaling. He's a, forecastle hand. He reads Chase's account of this
given
disaster.
The book by Chase's son.
Right.
When they, he's channeling the gods here.
Yeah.
And Melville reads this, and in his, he through the Nantucket Network got a copy of Owen Chase's narrative when he was working on Moby-Dick. It was very rare by that point, and is in his own copy. In the back of it would write, on the same latitude as where the Essex went down, I read this and had a remarkable effect on me. That's one of the biggest understatements in literary history. And but that wasn't his only connection.
No. He had, gone whaling. Melville was a collector of information, a collector of literature, a collector of ideas, filtering it through and then bringing it out into his works. And, as a young man to go whaling, read this evocative account in a forecastle, given to him by these family connections, and then to let that sort of percolate during the intervening years.
Yeah, it's just remarkable. And then he writes Moby-Dick, to my mind, the greatest American novel ever written. Unfortunately, it was panned by the critics. Readers fled screaming from this strange book. And it really marked the end, in a way, of his literary career, although he would keep writing. And, when I first moved to Nantucket, I was really excited because I was going to the land of the Pequot, and it was kind of a letdown when I learned that Melville had never visited Nantucket before writing Moby-Dick, but he would visit Nantucket the summer after writing Moby-Dick. Can you imagine this? Melville publishes his masterpiece, but it's completely neglected, visits Nantucket, traveling with his father-in-law. I love my father-in-law, but not necessarily the most auspicious way to go on a vacation. And his father was the judge. And they stayed at what's now the Jared Coffin House, then the Atlantic House. And living kitty-cornered across the street was none other than Captain Pollard. And as Melville would write also write in the back of his copy of Chase's narrative, and he would write in green crayon because by late in life, his eyesight had begun to go, and it is thought to have been a product of all those years out on the sea. His eyesight would go, and he would write on the back of in the back pages of his copy of Chase's narrative, sometime in the 1850s, visited Nantucket and saw Captain Pollard. To the islanders, he was a nobody, but to me, the most remarkable man I have ever met. I mean, and if that's not a character reference, I don't know what is. And I think Melville, who was there at the beginning of the tailspin of his career, saw in Pollard someone who had experienced the worst possible fate for a Nantucket whaleman, not once but twice, in losing his ship. I think he saw in Pollard a real kind of source of inspiration of how someone can survive something when the worst happens. Melville would return to that meeting with Pollard in a long poem he would write about called Clarel, in which recounts a trip to the Holy Land. But he recounts meeting a man who had lost a ship that had been rammed by a whale, and meeting him in a fog, and the tendrils of the fog wrapping around him like snakes. And it's got to be based on the circumstance that he saw Pollard. And so I think what's fascinating for me is, yes, Moby-Dick was inspired by the story of the Essex, particularly the sinking of the ship. But it would be the captain of the Essex who would really become a lifelong source of inspiration for Melville in the years after he wrote Moby-Dick.
Yeah, and I think that's very powerful, and that, we here at the NHA, in doing the history of the island, we talk a lot about ships and harpoons and technology, but we're really all about the people.
Yeah.
We're about telling real stories from real people, and making their stories and their experiences come alive to the extent that we can. And I think that's a great reminder of the effort we put into doing that. And with Pollard, it reminds me of the story you were telling about when you were on your book tour,
right,
in 2000.
Yeah. Well, In the Heart of the Sea came out in May of 2000. I can't believe it's 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. And I went on this extensive book tour, my first book tour. It was a strange experience, and it was a wonderful experience, but terrifying at the same time. And I was in St. Louis at Left Bank Books, still there, a wonderful bookstore. And as I came into the bookstore, there was a gentleman with a grocery bag holding it, clutching it. He looked at me as I walked by, and I didn't know, what was going on. And I gave my talk. And then he came up to me afterwards and he said, "I've got something I want to show you." And before he opened up the bag, he explained he had been on Nantucket several years before and had come across a yard sale where there were books for sale. And there was this old Bible for sale. And, he bought it for a couple of bucks. And he brought it back to St. Louis. And then he was reading my book about the Essex, Captain Pollard. And he looked back and he said, "Wait, what was the name inside that Bible?" He opened it up. It was the Pollard Family Bible, George Pollard's family. And so he said, should I have this? Don't you think it should be somewhere else? And I said, well, I think the folks at the Nantucket Historical Association would love to have it. And sure enough, this wonderful gentleman sent, it was in the mail by that week. At that point, there was an Essex exhibit. And within the week, the Pollard Family Bible was on exhibit at that exhibit. And so, for me, this was like the power of history to sort of bubble up.
Yes.
And, once the book came out, I got a card from the Ramsdell family in Pittsburgh. I grew up in Pittsburgh, maritime center of the universe. And they were descended from the Ramsdell on the Essex. And they said that they had an oral tradition in the family that when it came to Grandpa Ramsdell, and whenever it was time for dinner, they all sat down right away and began eating, because they all knew what happened when Grandpa Ramsdell got hungry. So another tradition that came down through the family. So, I mean, so what's been fun when the book came out, it was like, something that, where, the story just kept on happening, and it was really wonderful.
Yeah, and we have, the Bible is in the collection, and we had it in our 2015 show. And
and by the way, your exhibit was terrific. I mean, it was so fun that, you had it was a game basically that people could, you'd be one of the crew members, right? And you'd find out what would happen to you. And I was talking to someone who's was at that point sitting a couple of 4-year-olds, and they were twins, and one got one character, the other got the other character, and one of the twins died, was eaten, and the other survived, and it was a huge hit. So
thank you. Yeah, we did, for those in the audience who may not have had the chance to see it, when we represented the story of the Essex in 2015, we really sort of looked at, what are the core ideas of this story we really want our visitors to come away with, and that the story involves a journey was a key part of what we wanted to communicate, and that it involved real people. Again, getting back to that, connection to real people in the past. And so we built a reproduction boat of the right scale, that you could sit in and read quotes, a projection of quotes as the disaster gets worse and worse. And there was a big mural of the ocean. And then we had this path on the floor that you could follow their journey, to the whale, past the whale, the boats split up, leave people at Henderson Island, and then these cards. And at each of 5 or 6 places, your card, which would say, oh, look, I drew the card of Charles Ramsdell. Did he stay on Henderson Island? Oh, no, he didn't. He wasn't one of those men. Was he one of the first people? And that's exactly what would happen, is that you as the visitor could see what happened. And of course, many visitors, they would rifle through the little cards. There were 20 men, 20 cards. They would always be looking for Owen Chase or George Pollard. So those cards went really fast. But you could get randomly any of them. But yeah, very much foregrounding, that sort of horrible journey and getting your mind around what that might have been like. And then these were real people, and the survivors came back and had whole lives at sea, actually. And, we have artifacts from that. And
some of the great artifacts are the houses in which these people lived. I mean, we're living in a museum in many ways. And, I live off of Orange Street, and, the Owen Chase house is still there. The Nickerson, the house Thomas Nickerson was in, he was then a guest house. Nantucketers no longer hunted whales by this point. They fished for tourists, and Thomas Nickerson had this guest house that's now part of, it's on North Water Street, and is part of the Harbor House complex. There's the Pollard House there on Center Street. And, it's just amazing. You can go to, the cemetery, and, there's all these, Owen Chase's grave is there. And I had a remarkable opportunity to take 2 of Owen Chase's descendants, a sister and brother, to Owen Chase's grave, even before the book came out. And they have his portrait that is now here.
It's on loan here.
On loan here. And so, it sort of brought home to me, this is kind of a local story. This is local history in one sense for me, but one of the aims I had within the Heart of the Sea was to take what I had learned as local history in my book about Nantucket Away Offshore and try to make it more universal, to really focus on this as an endurance situation, as what happens to people in the worst of situations. I wanted to not make it just another whaling story, but something where if you grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and had never seen the sea, you might be drawn into the human element. And that's what it is. It's really the human element. If we don't engage with history emotionally, it really ultimately means nothing to us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we've been talking now for about 50 minutes. We have questions that people have been submitting. I think maybe if you're okay with that, we'll segue into that. And so the first question we have is actually somebody who noticed that you mentioned in your book that male sperm whales, bull sperm whales, are sometimes referred to as carpenter fish, and from loud clangs that they make to announce themselves to potential mates. And there is the story of whether the hammering of repairing the damaged whaleboat may have attracted the whale that attacked the Essex. And so the person asks, has there been any research into whether it really was the repair work to the whaleboat that led to the attack?
Yeah, well, when I was researching the book, I reached out to Hal Whitehead, who is one of the foremost sperm whale experts on Earth. He and his wife and their small children took a sailboat and basically sailed very close to where the Essex went down with very high-tech listening devices underwater, listening to they were really the first ones to develop a good sense of how sperm whales communicate. And it's through this process of clicks. And the females have clicks, males have more like a clang. It's like a boom kind of sound. And, and clearly they have, it's a real language, almost Morse code like sequence of clicks. And so I emailed Hal and said, explain to him as best I could from the evidence what happened. What did he think the whale happened? And he said, who knows? He said, because he was very familiar, obviously, with following the whales. He would tended to think maybe the whale just sort of blundered into the ship by accident and then got angry
right.
and came after it. These are sperm whales, male sperm whales are very territorial. And so they're like elephants. Male sperm whales will attack each other and fight over the females in a pod of whales. And who knows? I mean, it's ultimately, I have not heard a definitive, explanation for what happened. Unless we can find a descendant of that sperm whale has the oral traditions granddad used to tell, I don't think we'll know that. But and that's one of the great things about this story. At the center of it is this question: what was the whale thinking? Chase and looking at the whale attacking, coming at them, felt in his account, feels like, there's something going on. Melville channels this, there's some kind of malevolent deity or something going, what is going on there? It made its way into Moby-Dick. You can only imagine, but we'll never know. And I think that's what gives history real legs, where something of huge importance happens, but ultimately we'll never really, really know what exactly happened.
Yeah. Well, that's actually somewhat segues into one of the other questions, which is about, so we have these accounts that say what happened, that they drew straws in Pollard's boat. As certain men died, they resorted to cannibalism. And the question basically is, how do we know they're telling us the truth?
That's the question for when it comes to all evidence in history. And, the one thing when it comes to narratives, your people's accounts, when it comes to letters, they're biased. They're the person telling their side of the story. So when it comes to Chase's account, it's the narrative of an officer putting a voyage that went really, really bad in the best possible light, particularly when it comes to his involvement. What's interesting and usually as a historian, you want stuff that was recorded as close to the event as possible. When things are still hot, before people have had a chance to think too much about them, particularly if they're thinking about their own reputation. And that's what's really interesting about that letter describing Pollard's first account. It's a disinterested person recording this, coming right out of his mouth right after, as soon as possible. Nickerson's account was recorded late in life when a writer asked him to record his own account. And so that's suspect, but on the other side, he had the chance to talk to other survivors get information that Chase may not have had. And also, he's coming from a different perspective. He was 15. He was a cabin boy. He had no great professional stake in what happened, and yet, and so what he reveals are details about what happened during the initial collision that Chase chose not to include. That the whale, after it first collided with the side of the ship, ended up on the side of floating, stunned, knocked out beside the ship, with its tail very close to the rudder. And Chase had the opportunity to pick up a killing lance, this 18-foot spear, and motion to try to kill this whale that had dared to attack a ship. But then he realized that the tail was so close to the rudder that if provoked, this whale could take out the steering device, and this would be disastrous. As Nickerson says, if he knew what was going to happen, he would have risked losing the rudder. But Chase makes no mention of this. It's interesting. And so, in that instance, I tend to believe, Nickerson on this. I don't think he's making that up. And he had great respect for Chase. He was in Chase's whaleboat when they were finally rescued. On the other side, Nickerson claims they never had to eat anybody else.
Right, he does.
That it was the bread that kept them through, when Chase provides clear evidence that, there was, they were reduced to survival cannibalism. Nickerson was an old man who didn't want to be remembered as a cannibal. And so what you need to do is look at the various sources, think about, how their point of view would have bent what they said, and ultimately do your best to figure out what happened on your own judgment. And, that's why people need to return to these stories over and over again. There's no such thing as a definitive account of any historical event, particularly as we move through time and people are interested in different kinds of things. We look back and are interested in telling the story in different ways.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the other questions here is asking about, other differences between Chase's and Nickerson's narratives, because they're written at different times. And if you don't mind, I'll sort of address that. It's so fascinating to read Nickerson's account, again, written later in life. He clearly has Chase's account on his desk.
Yep.
And he's reading that, and it's a prompt to memory. And then he fills in other details. Or he chooses not to engage with certain things that Chase says that he, again, with the bread versus resorting to cannibalism. But really what Chase does is, or what Nickerson does, is fill in all this detail from the perspective of the 15-year-old boy instead of the perspective of the 20-some-odd-year-old officer with a career still to do. And they make a really interesting study that way. In fact, they're widely available. Anybody can read these sources. The Nickerson Journal is actually in our collection and is digitized and is available through our website. So anybody who wants to read it.
Yeah, and it's highly readable. It really is. It's a nice script, and the images are just amazing. And just think, that must have been a pretty traumatic process for Nickerson to relive this thing and record it and write it all out, and which makes it an interesting process. In any event.
Yeah. Another question that we've had is asking about the island that they stopped at for the week on their voyage. If they didn't know the name of the island or they were on the wrong island, how did the rescuers know where to get them? And I think, do you want me to answer that one, or do you want to talk to that one too?
You take it away.
Yeah, because they get to this island and they use what navigational equipment they have to take figure out where they are. And they open their copy of Bowditch. Bowditch is New American Practical Navigator. It's the Bible for navigators. And they look up, and it says they're at Ducey's, or however the name of the island is. Yeah, they're at Ducey's Island. And so that's where they think they are. And so when the three men stay behind and everybody else goes on, when Pollard and everyone else are picked up, they hire a British vessel that's headed across the Pacific. They pay them a fee to stop at Ducey's Island and pick up these three men. And so that the captain of that vessel is like, yep, I can find that. I know where that is. I'll go get them. He sails out and there's nobody there.
Yeah.
There's no evidence that anyone has been there. But he knows this area of the Pacific enough to know that there's another island across the horizon that's not in Bowditch. And that's Henderson, and that's where the men were.
Yeah. And what's really interesting is Henderson Island has since become a kind of a vortex for plastic, floating plastic. And so and I think it has to do with why the Essex guys ended up there anyways. The currents all sort of converge on this island, and so that's kind of why those 3 whaleboats ended up there. And the beach where they landed is now just full of plastic garbage. It's, this once Virgin Island, and it was Virgin Island when I was, not a Virgin Island, but it was absolutely pristine back when I was writing in the heart of the sea. I had the great fortune to run across a scientific study of the ecology of Henderson Island, a group of scientists that had lived there for an extended amount of time, all sorts of photographs. It was just hugely impressive, helpful to me. And then to see now, in the last 2 decades, what's happened to that place is just heartbreaking.
Yeah. So I think we have time for just maybe one more. And are there any other examples after this of whales attacking whaling ships?
Good question. Yes, there are. The question is, what was happening here? There was, were the whales getting more aggressive as they figured this out? There's also the possibility that, there were plenty of whale ships prior to the Essex that never made it back. Had they been destroyed by a whale beforehand? I mean, it didn't happen a lot by any means, but it did happen. While Melville was writing Moby-Dick, revising it actually in the summer of 1851, there was word came to him of a whale ship that had been attacked by
that's
a
the
whale.
Anne Alexander
Anne
disaster.
Alexander.
Yeah.
And he would write in a letter, I think it's to Hawthorne, would write, has my evil art raised this monster? I mean, talk about, whoa, man. But when I was researching In the Heart of the Sea, I explored every instance in which we had recordings of whales attacking a ship. There are even accounts during World War II of sperm whales attacking, metal naval ships, in a group. Who knows what behavior inspired that? But, it did happen. It didn't happen a lot, but, it was, it was the whaleman's worst nightmare, because if every bull sperm whale decided to attack a ship, it would make it very hard for someone in a wooden whale ship to whale.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we've reached the end of our time here this evening. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, for Nat Philbrick and Michael Harrison. And we are just delighted to have been able to have this conversation about the Essex disaster on the 200th anniversary of the event itself.
And thank you,
Nat.
Mike. Thank you, Mike.
Absolutely.
Yeah, really appreciate it. And thanks again to the NHA, because without this organization, I couldn't have written the book. And all Nantucketers owe the organization a huge debt of gratitude.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate it.